All right, buckle up, everybody. We're about to take a deep dive into the Middle Ages.
Yeah, but don't worry, we're not talking knights and castles this time.
Exactly. This time, it's all about how people back then thought about making moral choices. Practical reason.
Right, and how they wrestled with things like free will and divine law. Huge questions.
Exactly. And we're basing this deep dive on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on, get this, medieval theories of practical reason.
So medieval philosophy, a period where religion was like the dominant force, right?
Oh, yeah. So how did that shape their ideas about practical reason? Where do we even begin?
Well, gotta start with Augustine. Like, his view is super influential back then.
Okay, so Augustine, what was his big idea?
So he basically said that morality all boils down to following eternal divine law.
Like a set of rules from God.
Exactly. And get this, he thought this divine law was imprinted on our minds by God himself.
Okay, so it's like we've got this built-in moral compass, courtesy of the divine.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm. That's pretty different from, say, some of those ancient Greek philosophers, right?
Yeah, you're right. It puts a totally different spin on things. Like Aristotle was all about practical wisdom, phronesis.
Right, using reason and experience to navigate those ethical dilemmas, find that balance.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Medieval scholars initially only had access to part of Aristotle's work.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah, they were missing, like, his key ideas about phronesis.
Oh, wow. So they're trying to figure out this whole practical reason puzzle with a missing piece.
That's exactly it. Imagine that, trying to understand moral decision-making without the full picture of Aristotle's ideas.
Yeah, that must have made things interesting, to say the least.
You could say that again. It really shaped how they interpreted things. Like, you've got thinkers trying to reconcile this limited understanding of Aristotle with Augustine's divine law thing.
Okay, I could see how that would create some serious philosophical tension.
Yeah, for sure. So they had this limited view of Aristotle and Augustine's divine law to work with, and then, bam,
Who comes along?
Thomas Aquinas. He tried to do this huge synthesis.
Aquinas, the grand synthesizer, right? He was always trying to bridge different schools of thought.
Yeah, and he comes up with his own theory of practical reason.
Okay, so what's the essence of Aquinas' theory?
Well, for him, practical reason, it worked like logical deduction. Like, you start with this basic principle,
Which is,
do good and avoid evil.
okay, seems simple enough.
Right. But then it gets a bit more complex. He brings in this whole hierarchy of laws, like eternal law, natural law, and then there's synderesis.
Whoa, hold on. Eternal law, natural law, synderesis? My brain's already doing backflips.
Yeah, it's a lot. Think of it like a ladder.
Okay, a ladder. I'm listening.
At the top, you've got eternal law. That's God's big plan for everything, like the ultimate blueprint.
Got it. So eternal law, top of the ladder. What's next?
Then you've got natural law. That's how we, like humans, participate in that eternal law. We're like tuned into it.
Okay, so we're all connected to this divine blueprint I'm following. And what about synderesis? Where does that fit in?
So synderesis is like our natural grasp of those basic moral truths. It's like knowing that hurting others is wrong, that kind of thing.
Okay, so Aquinas is saying we're hardwired for morality, but not just randomly. It's directly linked to God's plan.
Yeah, pretty much. And this really resonated in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, definitely. But was everyone on board with Aquinas' ideas? I mean, there were always other schools of thought, right?
Oh, yeah, totally. And this is where things get really interesting.
Like what? Spill the philosophical tea.
So there are these Franciscan philosophers, right? They brought in this whole other perspective. Free will, man.
Oh, yeah. Free will versus determinism, that's a classic debate.
Right. And these guys like John Duns Scotus and William of Ockham, they were like, hold on, Aquinas, is a reason really all it takes?
Yeah, can't we choose to, mess things up a bit, even if we know better?
Exactly. They emphasized the power of the will, our ability to choose. They weren't so sure about Aquinas' whole logical deduction thing, like maybe our choices aren't just, following a set path.
So how did their view of natural law differ from Aquinas's? It seems like they're pushing back against this idea that God's plan is fixed.
You got it. For Scotus and Occam, God was so powerful that he could, like, reshape even those basic moral principles that Aquinas was talking about, the ones we were supposedly hardwired with. Yeah, so, like, God could change the rules of morality. That's pretty wild.
I know, right? It makes you wonder, like, if God can change the rules, what does that even mean for good and evil?
Right. It gets to, like, the core of this whole debate. Reason, will, divine power, all tangled up.
So we've got Augustine with his divine law, Aquinas with his hierarchy, and now the Franciscans are bringing in free will and a God who might just switch things up.
Yeah, exactly. It gets messy.
So where does Aristotle's phronesis fit into all this? Practical wisdom.
That's the big question, isn't it? How do you reconcile practical wisdom with a God who might just override everything?
Yeah, it seems like they could clash. Like, on one hand, we should use reason to figure out ethical stuff, but then God might just come in and change everything.
Yeah, and Aquinas actually recognized this tension. Like, he knew that sometimes faith wins over philosophical reasoning.
Really?
Yep. He even said, and I quote, "An old woman with faith knows more about how to live well than any philosopher."
Wow, that's a pretty strong statement from the guy who loved reason.
I know, right? It shows how those medieval thinkers, they were really wrestling with this whole faith and reason thing, trying to figure out where they fit together.
Okay, so we've got this whole mix of ideas about practical reasons in the Middle Ages. But how does it all compare to later stuff? Like, what about Kant? He was all about reason and universal moral principles.
Oh, yeah, that's a great comparison. There are definitely some similarities and some big differences there.
Okay, so give me the rundown. Medieval practical reason versus Kant. What are the main differences?
Well, like, one big thing, medieval thinkers, they were all about humans having this natural inclination toward good. It's part of us, you know. But Kant, he was all about purifying the will, like getting rid of all those desires and inclinations.
So Aquinas might say we're naturally good, but Kant would say, nope, got to rise above that and use pure reason.
Exactly. And another difference is that God, like Scotus and Occam, remember, they were all about God potentially changing moral laws, but Kant was all about universal moral laws, unchanging, absolute, no matter what, even if God tries to mess with them.
Ah, so it's divine command theory versus Kantian ethics. Like, is morality based on God or on this universal moral law?
Exactly. But even with those differences, it's cool to see that both medieval thinkers and Kant, they were all dealing with the same big questions. The nature of reason, the will, how we make moral choices. Those are things we're still trying to figure out today.
It's like they passed the philosophical torch and we're still running with it.
Yeah, exactly. Their ideas give us this awesome perspective on our own ethical dilemmas. You know?
So let's bring it back to our listener for a sec. Imagine you're tossed back in time to the Middle Ages, right? And you're in a debate with Aquinas, Scotus, and Occam. Who are you siding with on this whole practical reason thing?
Ooh, tough question. Who would you pick? Aquinas with his reason-based approach, or maybe the Franciscans and their free will and divine surprises?
Yeah, it really makes you think about what you find most convincing. How do we make moral choices today?
Exactly. And it also makes you wonder, like, how would those medieval guys react to our ethical dilemmas? They spent so much time thinking about divine law, but what would they say about how we try to figure out morality today without relying on religion so much, you know? I bet they'd have a lot to say about our secular ethics and all that. Like, could you imagine explaining AI to Aquinas or Occam? Would they even be able to wrap their heads around it?
Oh man, can you imagine trying to explain that a machine could make moral choices?
Right, like, could a machine ever achieve what they called practical reason? It really makes you think about what it even means to be human and moral.
Yeah, it shows that all these questions they were asking, they're even more relevant now. We've got new ethical challenges all the time, and their ideas can actually help us navigate them.
I know, it's amazing. Their insights are like a toolbox for figuring out ethics in the modern world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the big aha moment for our listener? What should they take away from all this?
I think the key takeaway is that those thinkers, even though they disagreed on a lot, they were all trying to understand the same thing. How do humans make moral choices? What roles do reason, will, and divine law play? And those questions are still relevant for each of us today. You know, we're all still trying to figure it out. Every time we make a choice, we're part of that same philosophical search.
Yeah, it's like they gave us this map, but we have to figure out the terrain ourselves.
Exactly. It's our journey now, figuring out what it means to live a good life and make good choices, you know?
And it strikes me that these medieval discussions, they weren't just like theoretical. They were dealing with real issues, stuff that actually affected people's lives.
Yeah. It's so cool how their theories actually influence things like political thought and legal systems, even how people understood their own moral duties. It wasn't just philosophy for philosophy's sake.
Right, like Aquinas' natural law. That had a huge impact on Western law.
Totally. And even today, things like natural rights and universal moral order, those ideas go all the way back to those medieval debates. They were wrestling with questions that still shape our world today.
It's amazing, right? Okay, so as we wrap up, what's the one thing you want our listener to walk away with? What's the big takeaway?
I think it's this. Even though they had their differences, all those thinkers were trying to understand how we humans make moral choices. You know, how do reason, will, and divine law all play into it? And that's something we're still trying to figure out every single day.
It's a journey we're all on, isn't it?
It is, and who knows, maybe someday future philosophers will look back at US and wonder the same things about our ethical debates.
I would love to hear that conversation. But for now, we'll leave our listener with this. Think about those medieval debates as you go about your day making choices. Do you lean more towards Aquinas and reason? Or maybe the Franciscans with free will and those curveballs life throws at you?
It's something to think about. And ultimately, I guess the answer is inside each of us. We're all on this journey together.
So until our next deep dive, keep those big questions coming. And remember, as Aquinas might say, even an old woman with faith can teach us a thing or two about living a good life.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Keep those philosophical gears turning.